Hey legends, my name is Mo and welcome to the Can't Can Will podcast. I'm a Raw Marine who is dedicated to optimising human performance and want to bring you exposure to the fantastic people supporting the same aim. In this episode I speak to a woman who has dedicated her life to supporting and treating people with addictions from drugs and alcohol, and we discuss her recent personal experience with dealing with cancer whilst continuing to make people better tomorrow than today. This episode has been sponsored by Discreet Chaos. Head over to their Instagram at Discreet Chaos and use the promotion code CAN'TCANWILL21 to receive a 10% discount on all clothing. Episode 7, Pam Diamond. I want to start from the start. 1971.
Way back then.
Is a date in the calendar that we need to be grateful for, I think. Can you just describe what it was like growing up, what your childhood was like?
Yeah, so I was born on the Wirral, Merseyside, so I'm technically a plastic Scouser, which proper Scousers like to remind me of. I was born in a place called Bromborough, which is South Wirral, so it wasn't kind of right in the thick of Birkenhead, which is where I ended up working. So, you know, it was quite a chilled area. You know, I was quite lucky with my upbringing. Both parents obviously worked, not obviously, but both parents worked, older brother by 5 years. So it was quite ordinary for what I saw. So the norm back then was as soon as you were allowed, so we were always playing out, which is quite different to today. Always, you know, wanted to be out, being made to come in, called back in, being out for as long as you could. So I started hanging around as soon as I could and just found that I loved the kind of buzz of hanging around on the streets, and, you know, that it was all, you know, there'd be things going on between different areas. And then in the early 80s, that was kind of probably early 80s, in the early 80s.
Why did you love it? What was it that you loved about? Is it just being outside and free, or what was it?
I think looking back now with adult eyes, it was the excitement and like the adrenaline of what we were doing. And sometimes we were probably doing things we shouldn't do.
Can you give any examples of that? Bill, Pam, come on, tell us.
Can you get arrested? Gosh, there's probably too many, Mo, but you know, sometimes we'd be getting chased by the police. I hope my mum and dad never listen to this. People were drinking, funny old thing. So alcohol was in my kind of peer group from when I was about 12. So, you know, now when I look back at that, that's so young, and now with my professional head on, it kind of has a different meaning. But then it was like we'd buy a bottle of cider, a 2-litre bottle of cider, and, you know, you'd stay out as late as you could, and then you get grounded, and that was the worst punishment ever, to get grounded. It was like being a caged animal. Whereas now you can't get kids out, can you?
I remember partaking in a bottle of 2020. Do you remember that?
Mad Dog 2020.
Yeah.
I think you're younger than me, aren't you? So
I am. Yeah.
When I was going out in bars, 2020. Yeah.
Although cider was also a good option because it's like £2 for a 2-litre bottle or something.
Absolutely. Like that. And I've never met anyone else who remembers this drink, but there used to be a drink called Stock, and it was in like a Cinzano bottle, a martini bottle. It was £2.79, and, you know, we'd wait and see if someone would go in the offie for us. And this Stock, apparently, I must Google it now, was all the dregs of all the spirits when they make spirits. Bizarre. I can still smell it and taste it. It was vile. So my intro into madness and pushing boundaries was quite early. And when I look back, my dad's quite a boundary pusher, so certainly not with substances, but he did well in business when I was growing up, and, you know, he had like a speedboat, and, you know, it was all quite flash at the time. But that, that's a whole different story. We certainly weren't rich. But when I look at his personality, that pushing all the time to excel and loving a bit of madness, I can see where my aspect of that comes in.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I've got one brother who's 5 years older than me.
And is he as free as you are, shall we say?
Is free as me. In what way?
Did you lead him astray when you were younger?
We hated each other. We hated each other growing up. Yeah, we love each other's bits now. Yeah, we used to properly fight. We'd properly fight. Like 5 years is quite a gap, isn't it, when you're growing up between siblings? And he was a massive sportsman, excelled at cricket. He used to play county cricket and football, mad Liverpool fan. And actually was in Hillsborough and was quite damaged. And obviously that's his story, or, I won't go into that, but certainly had a really bad time through Hillsborough. So, yeah, in fact, I've got an Anfield Road sign just behind my computer here. So, yeah, he was a massive sportsman. And
how old were you when that happened?
17, yeah. So he was 22. So that, I can come on to that. But just to go back to the kind of my growing up, heroin hit the Wirral really early in the UK. And that was because of the docks in Liverpool. So it was easier to import and distribute. So I was very aware of heroin in my early teens. And it just kind of fascinated me. And there was drugs campaigns and, telly adverts, and Panorama would be about the Wirral and drug use. And actually one of my cousins was in that programme because of his drug use. It was just in my face. And I guess because I'm intrigued about why people push boundaries, obviously I was intrigued then. I just became more and more interested in it, and also the criminal system.
Do you have any particular stories of your teenage years with regards to heroin, not necessarily specifically about you, but any of your friends or family that was affected by that?
Yeah, so as I say, I hung around in a gang. It's just what we did up there. Everyone did it. You had a gang of friends, not like a gang in terms of bad gangs that we think now. It was different. Everyone just had a gang of mates. And one lad, Christopher Preston, was a really, really good friend, really nice lad. So I grew up, I went through school with him. And then in my later years, when I ended up working in the drug service as a qualified nurse, he was actually a patient of the drug service, and he died of an overdose. So even prior to that, I'd kind of been intrigued by how you could have parallels with people, and one person would go one way and one person would go the other. So he and I had similar upbringing, similar privileges, choices, yet he ended up a heroin user and I didn't.
Why do you think you didn't?
Because I didn't make those choices. So I think that we're all presented with choices. Some of us are more privileged than others and may not end up in those environments to be presented with them, or have the support that if you are presented with them, and the resilience to say no. But I was always terrified of heroin.
Because it's an interesting point, because you say that you had a very similar in terms of environment that you both lived in and you played around with, and your schooling was very similar. So a lot of the environmentals were similar, albeit family relationships, which would be different. But yeah, you went on two different paths. And so how much do you think an environmental situation affects poor decision making? Because you've got an example of you going one way and not the other way.
I think it's a multitude. I think, you know, you've got a genetic potential predisposition, you've got personality traits that can lead you a certain way, and then the environment part absolutely plays something. So I was very supported in my background. I was also terrified because I knew that if I ever got in trouble, you know, my dad was quite authoritarian, so I had a fear as well, and I can't really remember why I was so frightened of it, but I was just really frightened of it, but and intrigued at the same time. And I think the problem with a drug like that, you can't mess about with it. You can't play around and use it. You know, I don't like the term recreational drugs, but you can't use it in people see party drugs sometimes. You just don't.
It's an absolute, isn't it? If you do it, that's it.
Very rapid. The descent into addiction is rapid, you know, within a few times. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Pink Floyd song "Comfortably Numb" is written about heroin. So if you listen to the lyrics, they describe how it makes you feel. So, you know, that's part of that draw into, you know, being sucked in very quickly, both psychologically and physically. So
I'd just like to stay on that particular subject about choice, because we often hear about people maybe making, we hear about people that might make excuses about an environment they're in, or there might be blame other people for the reason why they ended up where they've ended up. And then you hear on the other side of the fence where it's like, no, I had a choice to step out of that. And I just wonder whether there's a model to try and combat the wrong path, because on one side of it, you see a lot of people that will blame their situation that they're in, maybe an underprivileged background, or it might be a family dynamic, but then in the same vein, other people that have been in those situations have chosen the right path.
I think there's something about trying to instill positivity and hope in people. So I, over the years, have worked with people from the most desperate and sad backgrounds and situations. But if they've still got some hope and drive and support, you know, I think one of the things I say often to people is, as human beings, we're not supposed to be on our own. We don't do well with isolation. You know, we're tribal, aren't we? We're meant to be with others. So I think sometimes when people fall into these patterns of behaviours, they have no hope, and they have no backup, no support, no love. And I don't mean to sound cliched, but, you know, ultimately we all want to be loved, don't we, at some level, whether it's by our partner, parent, child. So if you've got nobody, I think that's really tricky. And, you know, that's some of the work I'm actually currently engaged with. So I think you've always got a choice, but sometimes those choices are really, really difficult to make if you haven't got a support network around you, even if that's only, and I don't mean to diminish this, it's only a clinician. If you've got one person in the world that you know is by your shoulder when you're going through something, you can do it. But if you don't have that person, then, you know, you can just sink into that introspective world, can't you, where you overthink, and what is the point? You know, people do get in that mode of thinking, don't they?
So you made a choice not to go down that path, which is admirable considering the situation that or your environment that you're in. So where did you decide to become poacher turned gamekeeper, as it were? Like where was the decision that was made to say, look, I'm going to become an addiction specialist now? Was it because of the environment you were in? Did it drive you towards that?
fell into it, Mo. So I don't see it admirable that I didn't make that choice. I think I was very privileged to be in a position to not have to make those choices, if that makes sense. Does that do it? Am I making sense there? Because, you know, I'm very privileged in many ways. And yes, I could have easily done that, but I didn't, and I had no reason to. And, you know, lots of people grow up with no love, and, you know, it makes it easier. So that, you know, I don't feel it's admirable. I you know, there's that saying there, but for the grace of God go I. You know, could have been me, it wasn't. So I always knew I'd work with people. So even when I was at school, I was doing placements in, like, they used to be called special schools, you know, working with children with severe disability. I always knew I'd work with people. Thought I'd be a probation officer because I was always intrigued why people were naughty.
Expert for experience.
Got in trouble. Yeah, I have. By the way, I've never been arrested. I've never had a criminal record.
The crime's getting caught, Pam.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I was just intrigued, and I think it's because I saw people getting into trouble, and you'd be like, well, why are they doing that? Why are they, again, choosing a path?
Where did the intrigue come from? What is it about people that you want to invest your time in?
I love people. I inherently fight for the underdog. I've realised I don't like injustice, and I can't stand somebody being disadvantaged or anything to do with it. Just hurts my heart. So I think that's probably where it started. Just intrigue. Why them, not me? You know what? I love understanding people, or trying to understand people. So I did a 2-year social care course at college. No idea about nursing at that point. Started working with adults with learning difficulties. And my friend who I worked with, he said to me one day, I'm going to go and be a psychiatric nurse. And I was like, what's that? And he said to me, and it, you know, back then it was what I classed as true psychiatry. So it was true mental health in terms of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, you know, people really, really unwell. And, you know, I was like, wow, that sounds amazing. So I applied for it, and then there you go. Within a short time, I was doing my nurse training. Started that in 1991, which I can't believe that when I say it out loud now, 30 years ago. In Chester, loved it. Best 3 years of my life, probably. Well, one of the best parts of my life. It was brilliant. There was a fair share of madness in it, a lot of pushing boundaries outside of work. But the training was traditional nurse training. So we would do 3 months on a ward, 2 weeks in the school of nursing, bit of leave, and then we'd go back 3 months. So we had so much hands-on experience. More intrigue about mental health for me. You know, I trained in an old asylum. So, you know, if you think how far mental health has come in 30 years, even in my career, I worked in an old asylum. So the hospital I trained in was, well, part of it was built in 1899, was it? You know, so long ago, and it was a traditional asylum. And some of the patients who I nursed had been incarcerated since the 50s for stealing, for sex out of marriage. So this is in my lifetime of work in mental health. Those people were still there. And they were classed as long-stay patients. They were institutionalised. Terribly sad. I can still remember some of their names today, and, you know, how they looked. Just really sad, but unbelievable learning experience. And that's where I started getting into addictions, because we had to pick a special placement in our final year, and there was a drug and alcohol inpatient unit in the hospital, which you don't see anymore. So I went there, and that's where it was like, ping, wow, addictions, this is my bag. I just loved it. I found I connected with the people. I think there was connections again from my growing up with drugs. The work, I enjoyed the work. It's really intense work. It's so rounded what you have to do with addictions. You don't just treat an illness, you're looking at so much more of the person.
Can you describe that in a bit more detail?
I think if you take, so let's say, and I'm not diminishing any illness when I say this, but for example, if somebody has a depressive episode, then absolutely you holistically assess them and you look at, what led to this. Is it more of a chemical thing? Is it situational? And you hopefully treat it. And some people may have that one episode, but with addictions, quite often it's been a long progression to get to the point of seeking help and then having intervention. Then that's probably years to get to that point. So you've got to do a lot of unpicking. And then for some people, if you've started using a substance as an adolescent, so a lot of people I encountered, they'd start using, so they wouldn't go straight into heroin. It would be a progression through other drugs and then heroin, and perhaps start using late teens. Quite often it would take until their 30s or later to want to address it. So what you've got there is a whole gap, and I still see this with alcohol, a whole gap of learning that's lost, emotional learning. If you think of that decade from 20 to 30, we do so much emotional growth, and a 20-year-old is much different than a 30-year-old. But if you've been using a substance throughout that time regularly and heavily, then basically you suppress any of that growth, and so you pop out the other end with potentially those teenage emotions still, and none of the emotional rounding, and regulation and maturity. So you've then got to teach somebody how to almost be sometimes.
And I suppose that's exacerbated if your addiction starts, or substance misuse starts, in your teenage years, because your teenage years are very formative and delicate in terms of brain capacity to learn that foundation for your 20s to 30s.
And then potentially you've got some brain changes dependent on the substance, because your brain's not developed. And for males, it's a bit later than females. So yeah, so it's really complex and intriguing, and the whole reason I chose psychiatry over general nursing was because there's no straight path. If you've got 10 people with depression, the pathway won't be the same for each one. Might be similar. Whereas if you've got a broken neck of femur, pathway's probably straightforward. Well, I might be talking that down there, but
it's a narrower field of investigation.
Yeah. So addiction was like another level of that, and it had, the behaviours, the family issues, so you criminal justice side of it was massive. So I was just like, my eyes were like, oh gosh, this is my field. I qualified in '94 and worked briefly in a hospital in Liverpool, but then I got the job with Rural Drug Service, which was as a substance misuse worker, nurse, obviously. And I was there 5 years and progressed through the system there. But that was, at the time, that was the biggest drug service in Europe, which is quite incredible when you think the world's tiny. Yeah, I think at the time the population was just over 500,000. But yeah, 500,000.
Do you have any standout cases that you dealt with that could articulate the diversity of what you've just been describing?
Yeah, I kind of remember one. So the way it worked, you had a caseload, My caseload varied between, depending on what role I had, because there was over 30 staff, which is massive. Way back then, this is the 90s. So we had, like entry points where people would need. So it was methadone prescribing. We were a huge methadone prescriber. So, for anyone listening that might not understand, methadone is a heroin substitute. So designed for somebody to be able to stop using heroin without withdrawing when they take it, like a prescription daily. That often didn't work. So people would use their methadone and use heroin on top. So really a lot of chaos. And I can remember one guy in particular who lived in a 13th floor of a high rise. So, classic high rise, call him Mike. And he was, so I was only early 20s, he was probably mid 30s, and he'd been using since he was about 13, 14, from quite a deprived area, deprived background. And a lot of the people I dealt with didn't really want to stop. They just wanted to survive. And part of their survival was being able to physically survive by using methadone and not withdrawing, and so a lot of chaos, a lot of dealing. But Mike and I had a really good relationship, and I took him to rehab once, and that failed, and that was a common cycle. And then I got attacked a few times. That wasn't uncommon. He tried to attack me once, bless him. Because there was a lot of anger about people wanting scripts for drugs, and it was just quite a weird time when I look back, and your threshold for what you accepted changed, because it was common for people to be kicking off and police coming and getting them removed from the service, and fights. We had a needle exchange. There was a lot of injectors. So Mike one day was trying to get at me through the door, banging on the door, which was quite scary because I had a really good relationship. I'm quite sad. And he ended up dying. He overdosed. But I think the standout for me was 1 year. So I had huge caseloads to manage. Now if you say to someone you're managing a caseload of 75 people, it'd be like, how do you do it? It's not great numbers. But I had 13 of my patients died that year. So it just kept happening. People kept overdosing, going over and overdosing, and it was like 13. I was just...
How did you feel about that?
Oh, awful. It's just because you clearly you build relationships with people, even though you've got a massive caseload, you still have to keep on top. And a couple of them were groin injectors. So, again, if people don't understand, once people start injecting heroin, quite often their veins collapse easily. So you've got less places to go in. So one of the places that people choose is their groin, which is, people would do that in front of me, and, people aren't in healthy states. And once people are at that phase, and this married couple, they both died, and, it just real sad times. I got locked in a house once, threatened. That was maker. Luckily, I had my support worker with me, and he managed to get us out.
Is there a common thread between people that are substance misusing in terms of their backgrounds or their family dynamics? Because I've got 3 children. One of them is 3 years old, and he gets loved and adored, like the other 2 do. And I ask about the environmental and the choice earlier, because for me, as having a parent's head on, you don't want that to happen for your children. So, but sometimes it's unavoidable. And so I'm trying to understand, for people that might be listening who are parents of young children, where they think, oh, it's not a worry bead now, but you want to make sure that they have the best life possible, as I'm sure some of your patients' families did as well, but they didn't. That never happened. Is there any common threads that you can explain or describe?
I think education and open talking is really important. So my daughter is 19 now, and clearly I've got quite a lot of insight into this area. So it's been a...
But does she listen to you? Because kids do not listen to their parents. They listen to other people.
Yeah. So, but it's been terrifying for me. So the way that I've tried to do it, and whether I've done it well or not, who knows, is allow your children to have informed decision making. So talk about things that are risks, and try and have that open dialogue. Because I mean, I was just told, if you ever dare use drugs, I'll kill you.
It was fear.
just fear, threat. Kind of worked. Not something I think I would recommend now, but open dialogue, education, but also the ability for your children to talk to you about anything. Because if they can't, then that's when, you know, things can, and sometimes it's difficult to hear your children talking to you about anything. And you've got to manage your own stuff within that. You know, I'm very lucky with my daughter Meg. You know, I think she does talk to me openly, but it can be tough. So I think going back to the experiences that I've had and seen, I would suggest that people didn't have that open dialogue, certainly back then, as much, but also what we saw, because heroin had been around for so long, within the drug service, we saw third generation clients. So you would have the grandparents were in the service being scripted, the parents, and then their children. So we have third generation users. So if you think about our own behaviours, if our children see those behaviours, it's far easier for them to see them as norms and start to engage in them themselves. So if you think about alcohol, a lot of the people that I work with, their parents have drunk heavily or they've been around alcohol frequently. So there is something about modelling as well, our own behaviours. You know, if you think about violence and aggression, if you've grown up around a shouty household or violent household, you're more likely to see that as norm. I'm not saying that happens for everyone, of course it doesn't. But, you know, there is something about modelling as well in this.
And is there any other causation for addictions, or can it boil down to an individual just being of that particular nature?
I think the genetic piece, so there's evidence now about genetics. You know, if we've got a close family member with a dependence issue, it can increase our vulnerability. And that's the word that I use, because you mentioned people using excuses before. Just because we have a vulnerability to something doesn't mean we just hold our hands up and go, oh, I've got a vulnerability, yeah, it's not my fault. My view and the way I try and teach people is, if you know you have that vulnerability, then you work with it. You don't just allow it to take you. And of course, it's not that easy. Again, you know, I'll go back to, if you haven't got support, if you are homeless, if, you know, thinking about the military, if you live on board all the time and you're very isolated, it can be really difficult to fight those vulnerabilities. But you know, my view is, if we have the advantage of knowing we have that vulnerability, then we can do something with it. Well, it's like, I know cake's going to make me fat, so should I just keep eating cake and get fat and go, yeah, it's because cake makes me fat? No, you do something about it. You know, I like to simplify it as far as we can.
Can you describe any situations where you saw the devastation that substance misuse causes families, and what advice would you give to families as well that might be going through that situation, being someone that watches, or the support mechanism for an individual?
There's one guy I worked with in the drug service who was not at the time, not our classic type of patient. So he had a job. He was a painter and decorator, quite a good job. Still lived at home with his parents, late 20s he was. And he was scripted methadone, so didn't need to buy heroin. But he kept relapsing massively and then accruing huge debts. He was from quite what you would class as a decent background. Parents really cared for him. He'd had a good upbringing, good schooling. So the environmental factors were positive. Job, blah, blah, blah. He was a single lad, but he kept messing up. They kept bailing him out. So every time he messed up, they would financially bail him out. And what that was doing was crucifying them. He was heavy into his drug phase. He didn't, there's something called the cycle of change. He was not at the point of wanting to do something about his behaviour. But mum and dad kept throwing money, to stop the dealers, basically cutting his fingers off and things like that. So that really sticks in my mind, because that's been a thread over the years of what I've seen, where if you think about our behaviours, we don't change our behaviours unless the consequences are undesirable to us. So for this guy, yes, he kept messing up, and yes, he kept upsetting his mum and dad, but really that was it. So he didn't have to find hundreds of pounds. He wasn't kicked out. So he was able to maintain that behaviour and that lifestyle through them. So there's something called codependency as well, where people who live with people with issues could become codependent, and they almost need that relationship to continue, because they get something out of being the kind of helper, if you like, and rescuer. So there was some codependency happening. And I've actually seen that really recently as well. And I always take it back to that case. So I'm dealing with a case at the moment. So I won't say too much because it is ongoing. But somebody with a huge debt through gambling, whose family, and we're talking nearly £100,000 debt, and this is a young man. His family have bailed him out every time. So there's been no real need to change. So it's almost that cruel to be kind from a family perspective, which as a parent yourself, and me being a parent, that's really hard to do, because the last thing you want to see is your child suffer. However, if anyone listening gets into that position, I would suggest the sooner that you can do that, the sooner you stop cushioning the fall, the sooner the person is likely to consider changing. And this is why within my role at the moment, I speak to command a lot to say, this is how you need to treat people with issues, because if you don't, they're not going to change. So it's a thread throughout families, throughout employment as well. You have to create boundaries for people, because often people with addictions have no boundaries. So as soon as you rein that in and create boundaries, the more likely that they will adhere to them.
Can you, just going back to what something you mentioned about cycle of change, can you just explain what that is?
Yeah, so that's a psychological model that if you think about any change behaviour, so if you start at the top, pre-contemplation, this is where you're engaging in a behaviour and you've just got no plans to change, you're quite happy, thanks very much. People around you might not be happy, and that's a common thing again. So quite often I will get calls from friends of somebody, parents of somebody, really needs help. they're going to kill themselves through drinking. I've had one this week. What can you do? We need to stop this. So it's the people around that are affected, and the person in the middle is going, well, thanks very much, I'm fine. They're not fine, clearly. Then that person, hopefully through whatever, will move to the contemplation stage where they're kind of, oh, okay, I might have some need to do something about this, whatever it is, alcohol, drugs. So they start contemplating, but quite often they swing back and forward, now I'm fine. And this process can take many, many months, if not years. The next phase that you want, so if I get someone in contemplation, that's brilliant, because I can enhance that, that if somebody's not really sure, if they're ambivalent, you start to kind of raise the ambivalence, get them to really think about consequences. What you want them to move to then is to action. So they start actually doing something about the issue. They start addressing it. If it's drinking, hopefully if it's safe to stop drinking, and you start really working on that action phase. And the nenext phase is maintenance, which is where you want people to stay. You want them to maintain those changes that they made in the action phase. So that's where you stay, you're really trying to stabilize and keep people there. And that's the ongoing support. Unfortunately, as we all know, it's not as straightforward as that. So if you see this as a circle, and this is a psychological model by Ptsd and De Clemente, so anyone can look this up. It is a circle. So let's say somebody stopped drinking for 8 months completely. Life is going well, there's lots of positives. But then one day they meet someone, an old oppo or old friend, and they go, oh mate, should we just go and have a pint? And they think, actually, if I haven't had a drink for 8 months, I'm probably all right now, which is really common. So they have that one pint, and then they get on it for the night. When they wake up the next day, they've got two choices. They can either say, what have I done? That really wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't in the plan. I need to get back to where I was before I met my mate. That's a lapse. The other option, so they move back then into the maintenance phase. The other option is they go, this is a nightmare. I've wasted 8 months. I've done the worst thing possible. Everyone's going to hate me. I've spent 200 quid. I'm a failure. I'm a loser. I need to go and drink again. And off they go. That's a relapse. And then off we go round the wheel again. So the way that I work with people is say, it's okay. If you lapse, you just need to tell me, or tell whoever, tell your support network, get it out there, and then get right back on where you were. Too often people are ashamed and frightened and feel like they've let me down or whoever matters to them. So then they have a relapse, and it's really hard for families and loved ones to understand. And in our setting in the military, for commanders to understand, because they kind of like, what's up with them? Why did they? But it's a really complex issue. So,
are there any threads between different types of addiction that, on a holistic level, you can identify addictive personalities before they become issues through misuse or gambling or whatever it might be, to basically, I suppose it's like a form of self-harm, to a coping strategy that people may use it. Is there any commonality between them?
I think you have to be careful when you start talking about addictive personalities, because there's no such thing. However, what there is, I would suggest, is probably perfectionist traits that make us push ourselves. So you might have addictive type traits of the behaviors, but they're not necessarily in substances. So if you look at people that really push themselves and they're perfectionists, quite often they're quite anxious and can have a high sense of failure underneath. So if that type of person then starts to utilize a substance to debrief themselves, if you like, then that's really risky, because they're probably boundary pushers. That's what I've seen over the years. People who push boundaries, if they then start to use, say, alcohol, they're probably going to push that boundary with alcohol as well. So I think, again, it's about education and understanding, trying to understand how we tick. And ultimately, when we drink, because it's so prolific in this country and acceptable and social and it's everywhere, we all generally know how we drink. So therefore, it's about recognizing that. And if you know that you're a nightmare when you drink, or you don't have that off switch, you know, which is a part, without getting too technical in the brain, there are findings now about sometimes people don't have what we call that off switch. So if you know that you don't have the capacity to say, I've had enough now, then you work with that.
Mine's usually when my card's rejected.
You've lost all your mates.
Yeah, and you just want to go home.
Yeah. So I think quite often people say to me, oh yeah, I've just got an addictive personality. What does that mean? You know, if you look it up in terms of medically, it's not there. So it might be in the States. I think they probably talk about it a lot more over there, but it's about the dependency that we can start having on issues like fears, like overworking. If you have that capacity, then potentially you might have that capacity in the substance area as well, or eating. You know, a lot of people that I work with find that they'll like maybe restrict their eating or overeat, or, you know, control is ultimately what's behind this.
How did your involvement with the military play out?
Yeah, so I did 5 years in the drug service. Then I went into mental health crisis on the Wirral, which was relatively new crisis teams back then, which again was quite mad. And we dealt with some really risky situations. So we would be the GP's point of contact out of hours for if there was a mental health crisis. So, you know, we would be going, me and one other support worker would be going into situations quite hairy. But back then, it was adrenaline, it was exciting. But then I got pregnant. I was married and got pregnant with Meg. And as soon as I had Meg, it kind of changed things. So, like I mentioned before, thresholds of what we saw and not accepted, but what we were exposed to were really high. So child protection issues, you know, just death, a lot of death and a lot of sadness. And I guess before I had Meg, I had some kind of buffer for it. And then I had Meg, and I just thought, I remember driving home one night after we used to do 12.5-hour shifts, and it was 9:30 at night we finished. And it was dark, it was in the winter, and I drove quite a deprived area of the world. I drove past the phone box. Phone boxes back then, you didn't see phone boxes really now, do you? People in the red phone boxes. Phone boxes then were what everyone would use to score drugs. So that's where phone boxes were used for that. People didn't have mobile phones back then. And there was a girl in the phone box, and she had a buggy outside the phone box, and there was a really young toddler in the buggy, and it was freezing and dark, and I was going home to Meg, wrapped up in bed, and it made me feel so sad that, you know, there was this little one, and Meg had been tucked up in bed since hours before. So, and then got locked in another house by, that was...
Whilst you were pregnant?
No, I'd just come back off maternity leave, and then you only had I had 4 months off for maternity leave, which now I think, gosh, so Meg was tiny. This guy who was really unwell, we went to do an assessment and he locked us in and then said that he wanted to kill a woman and was aiming it at me. So we had to make a sharp exit. So all this was like what we were doing, just day to day. And then I thought, I don't want to raise her up here. I don't want to, my friend who I worked with, he'd had an incident where his wife had quite a nice car at the time, and he'd woke up one night and 2 guys, balaclavas, with crowbar in his door, screaming at him for the car keys, and it was just, this is like back in 2001. And I'd always had a connection with Cornwall. We came here every year on a holiday. And then we brought Meg down here for a holiday, and I just thought, I want to raise her here. I don't want to be up there with her now. So relocated in 2003, started working in the mental health unit in Derriford, just while I was looking for a job. And then saw the Ministry of Defence advertising for an alcohol nurse specialist for the Southwest, and I read the advert and went, that is my job. I have to have that job. So I did loads of research, no military understanding at all, no knowledge, no background, did loads of research, lucky enough to get an interview, and then lucky enough to get given the role. So that was in 2004. And I was the tri-service alcohol specialist for the Southwest, so based in Drake in Plymouth. I loved it. Found this life of the military, this like bizarre life with a different language. And they'd be talking about going ashore, and I'd be like, but we are on ground, and they'd be talking about having a wet, and I'd be like, I'll go for a swamp. And so I was tri-service as well. So it took me a good 6 months to understand the military.
4 different languages there.
Yeah, I was more interested in certain aspects. So, in the Southwest, there's mainly Navy and Marines. So someone bought me a copy of Jackspeak when I got the job. So I was like, this is mad. So it took me 6 months to understand this world, but I loved it, absolutely loved it. Loved the boundaries, loved that it was straight and to the point, and it just keyed into something in me. I got it, and I started building the role and doing a lot of work with command, because I kept saying, that people were in trouble all the time and developing issues. Threshold was a lot lower than what I was used to, obviously, because we were more occupational mental health to keep people at work. And then I started developing like briefings to the command to say, this, if you start to do this, maybe this won't happen at the other end. It kind of made sense to me, so that gathered a lot of speed.
But for them they don't know. And I use a saying, you don't know what you don't know.
Absolutely.
And interestingly, that's not very different in other parts of life either. With management, you don't know what you don't know, and if you don't know how to change a status quo, you're never going to get a different result.
And I think sometimes there can be an arrogance that if you're in a certain role, then of course you know it, and of course it's the right way. So to come in as a female civvy was quite interesting, and I had to work really, really hard to be accepted and listened to. But in a way, as a female civilian, I had a bit more flex, because I wasn't being drafted every 2 years. to a different base, well, I wasn't just in that job because I was a chief or a lieutenant commander. I was picked for that role. So I was quite bold, I think, at times. And then I heard of these beings called the Royal Marines, but they never came near. So I was in the DCMH. So for anyone that doesn't understand, the Departments of Community Mental Health, which the military have many of around the country. And although we were heavily populated geographically by Marines, we didn't really see them. So it really, again, I'm intrigued. I want to understand. So it started like trickling. So it was kind of post-Telic and very early.
Telic being, it was
Iraq.
Iraq, yeah.
And then Afghanistan started kicking off. So we had a slow trickle, but again, I would be seeing these real alcohol issues and people at the point of almost being discharged from the Marines. But I had no in. So again, I was a little bit bold, and I was very fortunate to be invited by one of the RSMs at the time to do an educational brief.
And explain what an RSM is.
They're regimental sergeant major, so they are the senior NCO within that unit. So very respected. You know, it takes a long time to get to be an RSM. You have to go through a board. You know, they are God, really. And, you know, they are in charge in many ways of the unit, obviously along with the commanding officer and other commanders. And this certain RSM, then he bought into my message. So whatever unit he was at, he would invite me. And then I started to get a role in like a suite of these briefs, really, for the lads, for the command, and whatever was happening, I would keep adjusting it. So I think one of the things I found in the military, things could sometimes stay static. So, you know, let's do a brief on this. Okay, we've written that brief. Yeah, there's the brief you need to deliver, and the brief's then 4 years old and hasn't changed. You know, that was what I saw at the time. So I kept, and still do this, keep changing depending on the environment, the atmospherics, what's happening, what the issues. And fortunately, I started to understand the Marines far more, and I think that's an issue that people may not understand themselves, that it's a very closed, unique environment, the Royal Marines, and again, female civilian, quite difficult to be accepted, and it took years and years. And then along in parallel to this, obviously I had a caseload of people, and I would be dealing with more Marines, and I did my trauma training. So I did my EMDR training, eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. So I would be dealing with Marines who'd served in theatres of war and had real significant issues alongside alcohol. So I feel extremely privileged to have done all those trauma interventions, because I got a real understanding of Afghanistan and certain tours in particular, because I would deal with multiple lads from same tours and still do. So I just loved the kind of ethos in the Corps, and that real drive and let's just get this done, and passion, you know, it just brought into a lot of me, really. So I stayed in the DCMH for 13 years, and then I felt I'd kind of outgrown and needed to, I could have easily just stayed there and sat pretty for a long time, you know, just to retirement, but I get thirsty really for knowledge and growth. So I decided to leave, which was really strange. It was actually like a grief process. I because I actually loved the job. I felt I needed to go. So I grieved once I left. So I secured a job. I managed a liaison psychiatry team in Derriford Hospital, which is the general hospital in Plymouth.
So interestingly, you mentioned about grief. I don't think that's too dissimilar to people that leave service on a normal or voluntary or told otherwise. I think that is from that particular cohort, that is something that happens, but we don't necessarily label it as that.
Yeah, which I think is a shame, isn't it? Because I can vividly remember. So I cried when I left, which, you know, I'm outwardly emotional anyway. I don't mind people knowing if I'm sad, or I'm happy, or I'm feeling a bit mad, or whatever.
Or assertive.
I'd be having dreams. I would have dreams, like lost dreams about, you know, just really strange, really sad. But I went to this job in the NHS. It was a brilliant job. It was a really hard job. So liaison psychiatry, for people that don't know, is basically mental health in the general hospital. So if you have an overdose and attend A&E, you will likely be seen by a liaison psychiatry nurse or member of staff. So I managed a team and had to develop this team into a 24-hour service. It was like, well, the day after I started, my line manager said to me, "Hi, Pam, you've inherited a feral team." That wasn't told at interview. So yeah, it was quite a tough job. However, I loved it. It took a lot out of me. It was, you know, extremely long days most of the week, because it was such a big job. But I absolutely committed to it. And all the time I kept in touch with certain people, because, you know, a lot of my friends are Royal Marines. And one in particular was the brigade RSM at the time. So again, a very senior RSM over some of the units. And he's a friend, and he rang me up one day and he just said, "Pam, we want you to come back. We feel that there's a gap since you left that hasn't been filled. And the Royal Marines charity want to create a post." So for me, that was like winning the lottery, and still is. There's a but, because I found it really difficult I absolutely knew I would come back, but I felt extremely disloyal to the team and the service that I'd just managed to build up, you know, without blowing my own trumpet. We were doing really well, and it come through really tough times, this team, and we'd really got somewhere. Services had improved, patient experience was better, and I felt like I was jumping ship. But I had to take it because it was my dream job, and it still is. So I came to the Royal Marines charity in 2019 and basically picked up a little bit where I left off, because it was just my role is just with Royal Marines, but whereas before it was just the Southwest, it's now national. My role with the Serving Marines is education as opposed to treatment, because DCMH still treat. But the big add-on is now Royal Marine veterans and their families, so I can now support them as well. So through the Royal Marines charity, that's been a huge development. So there's no other military cap badge charity that has a role like mine. So, you know, the growth has been huge in the charity over the last couple of years, you know, merger with the RMA, and there's lots of transitional support now, and the veterans referral plan where we can, you know, offer therapy. There's so much growth now.
Yeah, it's been amazing. It's been amazing seeing the transformation that's happened in the support and services, and now because we're very reactionary, I think, in the past, and now it's moving into being proactive and trying to put things in place in prevention as opposed to detection. And yeah, it's been night and day really on how far and quickly as well that the support and mechanisms and organizations have come in such a short space of time. And that's through no small part that you play. You know, I know personally people that you've literally saved their lives, and you can never underestimate that, which is the reason why they were desperate to get you back, because they knew the effect that you had and the experience that you've got and the expertise, and that's what they wanted to influence. The more guys. I'd like to change tack slightly now, if I may. So can you describe what happened last summer?
Yeah. Don't think you're talking COVID either, are you?
I'm not, no, because that started last February, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think if I go back to then, just briefly, so my role, brilliant, cutting around the units, Scotland, doing briefs, 4-3, 4-5, commandos. And then COVID hit. So the charity were forced to work from home. And, you know, like everyone, that was really challenging. Fortunately, our IT infrastructure had been upgraded, so we were really lucky to be able to utilise what we have. And I started supporting beneficiaries from home. Really tough. I found that really challenging, because the majority of my beneficiaries, patients that were struggling most, were the younger veterans who were living on their own, which I found just desperately sad and needed a lot of support. So I feel I worked really hard through the first lockdown. And for my own sanity, I really looked after myself. So I started doing lots more fairs. You know, it was spring, it was great, training outside. You know, training's important to me anyway, but I started doing charity challenges to add a spin and raise money. So really looked after myself to be able to look after others better. And then I got a letter for a mammogram. So I'm not old enough for normal national screening yet. Nearly am.
You don't look it, by the way.
Oh no. And I was like, oh, this is good. It's a local, in the Southwest, they're doing research for early breast cancer. Go along. It was just when lockdown was lifting in June. So it was middle of June. Go along on Saturday morning, mammogram, fine. Working, a few days later, got a letter. You need to come back for some additional tests. And I can vividly remember opening it and going, oh, that's a bit weird. So I went back for extra tests, these special biopsies, and just thought, oh, well, someone else I know who's a similar age had breast cancer and needed a lumpectomy, and, you know, it was fine. So I thought, oh God, I might need a lumpectomy. Okay. Another appointment, you need to come in and see. And because I'm a nurse and because I'd worked in that hospital, I kind of know some of the language that you might not know unless you've been in that environment. So I wasn't told who I was going to see. But I thought, if I ask who I'm going to see, I kind of know the severity then. So when I asked who I was going to see, they said, oh, so-and-so. And if you don't know about medical stuff, surgeons are always known as either Mr., Mrs. or Ms. They're not called doctor. It's a funny thing in surgery. It goes back. It's a traditional thing. You're going to see Mr. So-and-so. And I thought, oh, I'm seeing a surgeon. So on the 1st of July, I go, the surgeon's off sick. So I had to wait for ages. My husband was with me. And it was, everyone was wearing masks then. So, you know, everyone was, we were in, well, everyone still is wearing masks, but I had a mask on, this doctor had a mask on, the nurse. And the doctor came in and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm late. You need chemotherapy, you need surgery, and you need to start this now." So all you can see is eyes. And I just thought, what? And she said, "So you need chemotherapy, and you have I don't even know if she said you have a tumour. She said, she did not say at any point you have breast cancer, which I've flagged up since with one of the breast nurses because I think you need to hear it." So this appointment was like probably 20 minutes long. So myself and my husband walked out just in silence. He's a former Royal Marine. So you know, he is very resilient. So we walked out in silence and just got in the car and didn't speak. And then we were driving home, and for anyone that knows Devon, we were on the A38. And the next thing, there's this dog loose on the A38, this Springer Spaniel, and I'm a mad animal lover. So I'm like, oh, there's a dog loose. So the next thing, we're stopping, holding the traffic up, and he's wrestling this dog to the floor, trying to hold up 2 lanes of traffic. I'm thinking, this is like some kind of mad dark comedy here. Is this really happening? And then we got home and we took our dogs out, and I don't think I'd absorbed it then. Thanks for the night. I need to tell my parents, they live 5 minutes away. And I think that was the first time I said it when we went to see my mum and dad. And, you know, I was in tears, and I just said, I've got breast cancer. And yeah, so that was the 1st of July. Then I had to tell my daughter, which was horrendous.
How did it feel? How did you feel when you said it for the first time?
Like quite surreal, because I went from thinking, oh, this is a bit weird, there might be something, to, oh, sorry, back in the appointment, I said, do I need a mastectomy? And she said, yes. Excuse me. So it was just a bit bonkers. And then within days, I was in for a biopsy, and very fortunately, the cancer hadn't spread, because I've got, what I've now found out, I've got an aggressive cancer that was feeding off my estrogen. So I'm not menopausal, so I've still produced estrogen, so the cancer was loving it. And that's why it's an aggressive cancer. So then I started my chemotherapy, you know, it's just appointments here, there and everywhere. And before you know it, and I still haven't met my oncologist face to face. That's something through COVID that's been really difficult for cancer patients. You know, it's been, a lot of it's been alone or phone calls. You know, I couldn't take anyone to chemo. I had to go to most appointments on my own. You know, everyone's masked up, which, you know, of course I appreciate, but that makes it more difficult when you're crying your eyes out and the nurse has got to stay 2 meters away from you and wants to give you a hug. Yeah, that's been tough.
I suppose that comes back to a point you made near the start of this conversation about connection, that you need connection, and even more so in dire times as well.
Absolutely. Because I think, so it's ironic really, being a nurse myself, how little I knew about cancer. And every cancer is different. Everyone's treatment path is different. So if someone's having chemo, it's not the same. You know, you have very specific drugs for your cancer. You have very specific doses. I was on a really high dose, and it well, nearly killed me, literally. Because if people don't know, chemo is basically a poison. So it poisons your body and kills the cancer, but also kills all your good cells. And the reason you lose your hair, the reason you can lose your nails, the reason your skin goes terrible, your mouth is awful and you sore, is it affects the rapid growing cells first. So all of those areas in your body grow rapidly. So I know you can see me at the moment, Mo, but nobody else can. My hair, I had long hair before, I've kept about 40% of my hair. And that's because I was fortunate enough to use a cold cap, which makes you look like an astronaut. But basically it's like an ice pack that you have on your head and it's plugged into the electrics to keep it at -4 throughout your chemo.
I've heard it's quite a pleasant experience as well.
Yeah, it is. It's like constant ice cream freeze. So
for those listeners, I'm joking, by the way.
It's it's just like another thing, but it's horrible, and some people rip it off because it freezes your head and it puts the follicles to sleep. So I managed to keep like probably 40%. It's grown back now, but that's really distressing when you start losing your hair. You know, you for anyone that's heard people with cancer talk about it, it literally comes out in clumps, and I can vividly remember a day when that was happening, and just not only do you feel horrendous, I think the best word I can use to describe my last 7 months is terror. Just terror. Waking up in the night feeling frantic. And you're also affected by all the drugs. You know, and one of the worst things that people can do is talk about someone else who had cancer, who is doing really well, or what one person said to me was, and this is just before I started treatment, oh yeah, I know someone, they had that cancer like that, and but then it came back, and you're like, really? And another thing I have asked people not to do is ask what the prognosis is, because when you've got cancer, you are, I speak for myself, terrified. You know, especially when you've got children and you don't know what's going to happen. So someone to basically say to you, do you know when you're going to die? Because that's what they're asking, is so unhelpful. And apart from anything, cancer services don't give you a prognosis now. They give you percentage chances of living, which I haven't had yet. And I don't know if I want them, actually. So until you are 5 years clear, you're classed as still having cancer in a way. So back to the chemo. I had 4 rounds of chemo. I was supposed to have 6. It had to be stopped because I was so unwell, and they kind of thought it wasn't working, which was terrifying. What's chemo like? Just horrendous. Apart from the physical stuff, you can't think, you can't get your words. You're just a tip for anyone that ever knows someone with cancer: do not buy them flowers if they're having chemotherapy, because your sense of smell is better than a bloodhound. So smell triggers sickness. So I would be getting flowers and I'd have to just give them away or put them away from me. One of the worst days, I could smell all the wood furniture in the house, and it was just making me sick. I had to cover up the wooden furniture. The smell of a tea bag made me throw up. And you feel like you're dying, I suppose. But all the time you hope that it's killing the cancer. So you're stuck in this But I think one of the most difficult things for me, but one of the biggest learning experiences, was going from being fit, well, doing charity challenges fitness wise, really life was good, to then have that rug pulled. But what it's made me think a lot about is the patients I've dealt with trauma, because it's similar. They've been living the dream and then suddenly a major life-changing experience. And I have never put enough kind of emphasis on that part of that loss and adjustment. I think sometimes we miss that adjustment, so we treat what maybe the trauma symptoms are. So I actually meet the criteria for PTSD now because it was such a shock and life-threatening. And
do you think you've got PTSD?
I've certainly got adjustment issues, certainly, and where I'm at in my treatment pathway. So I had the chemotherapy, without boring people, lots of issues along the way, blood transfusions, infections, and I had to stop the chemo because I was so unwell. And then I had a mastectomy, but I had to fight for having reconstruction at the same time because of COVID. So my operation nearly got cancelled, and what they had to do was book me in as a day case to do a full mastectomy and reconstruction, which is just not what you do. But if they hadn't done me as a day case, I wouldn't have had my surgery, which again is terrifying because that would have mean the cancer was still there. They thought the chemo wasn't working. So that was a really difficult time. That was the end of October. But then I had the operation, and that was absolutely a massive step forward. Recovery's been quite tricky. I've got some other issues around nerve damage that's ongoing. Still having one of the chemo drugs.
How have you managed to cope throughout the last 7 months?
I've been really lucky in the support I've had. So I think the Royal Marines and Royal Marine Veteran Network, because I decided from the beginning to be really open about it for two things. One, because I couldn't bear the thought of people making their own minds up about why I'd kind of gone a bit quiet. Because I still carried on working until I had my mastectomy. Worked through chemo, which when I look back, I'm like, that's a bit mad. But the charity were amazing. I had a lot of flex when I worked and when I didn't work. So I, hugely appreciate that. They really looked after me. So I decided to be really open because I just wanted to get it out there. And I think that worked. And I've used social media in that way because I thought I can't bear people wanting to know and not know and make their own mind up. I may as well just get it out there. And I wanted to do it a bit to say to people, if you get a screening invite or if you don't check yourself, male or female, you need to do it because this is terrifying. You don't need to go through this if you go for screening. If I hadn't gone for that screening, if I didn't live here, then who knows? But I think we know I wouldn't be here at some point.
Do you think about death a lot?
No. I'm curious, and I kind of believe the cards are dealt. So the cards are dealt, and you can either do your best with those cards, which is what I'm trying to do, or you can give up and not do all the right things. So one of the other commitments I made to myself was to move every day through treatment. So that I carried on running. I've got a treadmill at home. Carried on with weights up till surgery, and the watt bike. But then obviously after surgery that changed, and I had to have 12 weeks where I couldn't touch a weight. And a certain doc who's known very well to the Royal Marines said to me, you shouldn't be lifting anything heavier than a tin of beans. But I made promises, and I think a lot of what I tried to do was for the people I know. So the people I've worked with that have dug out blind for me in terms of treatment when I've asked them to. For the Corps, the Royal Marines, who've been amazing. That support has been incredible. The charity, my family. I guess it comes back to what I said at the beginning, though, that if you've got love and support, it makes things easier. And obviously I'm quite driven and I'm quite positive. But yeah, there's been times where, of course, I dread and real fear. So what I must say is, after my operation, it came back that treatments have been really successful. So that's brilliant. That's best outcome. They call it complete pathological response, which I've had, which is great. So where they thought the chemo wasn't working, it actually was. The issue is I am still at risk. So, I'm going to be having more surgery at some point. I'm on medication. I'm having issues with the medication. It's not straightforward. And I think if I'd have lost all my hair and looked like the stereotypical cancer patient, I think people might have understood it a bit more. But I think because I'm really keen to still project looking okay and trying my best, sometimes people, and this comes into mental health, I think we make huge assumptions just because of the way someone looks. Because I'm in bed sometimes still, and I'm not happy to say that because I think it's important. I'm back.
Why do you project that? What's the reasons for that?
Because it's important to me. It makes me feel better, for a start. It makes me feel like me, because I guess we all have a bit of a suit of armor, don't we, when we're in our roles. And it's I have those standards of myself that I want to keep. I'm so glad I didn't lose all my hair, and that's a vanity issue. But I think working with largely a male environment, that would have been really, really tricky. And you know what the sense of humour is like in the Marines. But yeah, it's a funny thing. Sometimes I'm working at home. It's all video calls, and people go, "Oh, you look great." And I think, okay, I might look great. I don't think I look great, but actually, this is still really tough. Really tough. I'm still having loads of appointments and uncertainty, and there's a thing about when you've got cancer that when treatment either stops or ramps down, that can be the really tricky time, because when you're having treatment, people are all over you in a certain way, even though fortunately I was at home, so I didn't have to face people. I'd be getting sent things all the time, and people were amazing. But I think once your chemo finishes and your surgery finishes, people go, "Oh, you're all right now. Right, crack on, off we go." But you're not. There's a long recovery journey. I hate that word journey, but it is. It's a pathway, and I wouldn't change it. The only thing I would change is what my family have had to endure. My husband, my daughter, and I'm a parent.
I was just about to ask you about that. What effects have you seen on your family?
I can't even imagine, and I don't want to for now. It's because I'm glad it was me, because then it sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? Because then I want to take it, but then to watch, I would not say I would rather it was them, because I couldn't bear watching someone go through it. And I think, for my parents, Meg, my daughter, who's been a bit back and forward from uni, it's her and I are extremely close. my husband Neil, fortunately, he's quite straightforward, and we're a bit yin and yang. So he's been very steady. But I can't imagine, and that, in fact, I was thinking about this last night. I was thinking it is something I will ask, particularly my mum, at some point, because I can't imagine it as a parent myself, you know. I know I look a lot better than I did now, so I think that's probably helpful for people around me.
Do you ever get a sense of, this might sound like a bit of a strange question, it's not only because of experience from another individual that I've spoken to, one of my friends years ago. Do you ever get a sense of guilt about it happening to you and it affecting your family?
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. Yeah. So when I say I wouldn't change it because I think, well, what's the point in wishing it didn't happen? Because it has happened. It was my cards. There we go. I've been very, very lucky in so many ways to get the mammogram, to get treatment through COVID, to have the response, to get my reconstruction. I've got a new boob. Hugely lucky. But yeah, guilt for putting them through it, because it when you're helpless, I've been able to do this. That makes sense, you know. Do treatment, engage in treatment, be a good patient, which for a nurse is really difficult. We're nightmare nurses, and medical professionals around the world, I'm sure, are nightmares to treat, because we're curious. I'm curious about everything. But yeah, to see them go through it, and everyone's willing you to survive. That's what you feel, that everyone's just desperate for you to survive and tell you to be strong and you can do it. And sometimes I remember having a video call with a close friend during, and I just got really upset. And people struggle with that, I think, when you're upset, because they just everyone's willing you on, like cheering you. When sometimes you can't be cheered, you know, you just need to go with it. And he sent me a card afterwards, and it said, "You were given this life because you're strong enough to live it." And I loved that. So when I was struggling, that was mid-chemo, I just kept thinking about it and thinking, I can do it, you know. And yeah, it's just day to day, back at work now, which is great. Just I'm hugely aware though now of adjustment for people when their life has been just cracking on as it does for us, and then a major issue changes it. That rug getting pulled is the way I see it, and it's something that I've not given enough attention to before. So that's something I want to be more aware of now in my own practice.
You mentioned about the support that people were giving you, and maybe not necessarily in although good intention, but not necessarily delivered in the most sensitive way. How would you, what advice would you provide people being in the situation of the person that receives, to try and reach out to help? Because we've had the conversation before where I never reached out to you because I thought, everyone would do it. And you're like, well, that's not quite right, you know. And so whilst good intentioned, it wasn't necessarily the right, well, not necessarily right decision, but you get my point.
I think it's you know, that saying that you find out who your friends are. That what I did find out was only a couple of people that I would have expected to have been there weren't, and that's okay. That's fine. People have their own reasons, and that's okay. But people that I never expected reached out, and I think because I've got, and I don't want to sound big-headed, but because I've got a profile in the core, because I'm the only female doing that job, that's it. You know, it's that's the reason.
You're one of one.
If there were 100 of me, it'd be different. I think lots of people thought like you thought, that oh yeah, Pam will have loads of people, but lots of people were saying that. Oh, I didn't want to bother you, Pam, because I'm sure you've got loads of people. And actually, I didn't, and that's okay. You know, that's okay. And everyone's got their own stuff going on. That's the way I thought about things, that everyone, it's not just about me. Okay, I've got breast cancer, and it was quite shocking, I think, for a lot of people because of what I'm like. Does that make sense, what I've just said? Yeah. Because I've been shocked when other people have been diagnosed with serious illnesses, you know, and you think, oh, wow, they were all over it, you know.
I think it also comes back to a situation as well where quintessential British people do not want to necessarily pry as well. And so you sort of either admire from afar, or you suffer from afar, or you empathize from afar, but actually being involved is probably not because people don't want to, but more just because the way it is like, keep yourself to yourself. That's their business, and there'll be people there in their inner circle that can help with that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, you know, I've used social media quite a lot and used that almost as a filter to allow people to know, and it's been really helpful. You know, I know social media can be poisonous and toxic and vile, but I've been really lucky, and I've had so much support from people I've never met, you know, and not that I was using it for that, but I was almost using it as a bit of a, this is where I'm at, you don't need to worry, or you don't need to ask. Maybe that's why people also wouldn't reach out. But I've got no drama at all with what people did or didn't do, because it, as I say, who am I to judge why somebody that I might have thought would be different? You know, I've had far more positive surprises, if that makes sense, you know, and just people expressing support and love, and, you know, keep saying about love a lot, but that's what I felt, you know. And I think what I'd like to just mention, nothing to do with my cancer, but my work and suicide. So one of the things that struck me last year is I think that people who take their own life don't know how loved they are. You know, so I think if you use Caroline Flack as an example, and it's almost the anniversary of her death, if she'd have known how loved she was, that outpouring afterwards was quite spectacular, then I wonder if the result would have been the same. And I think the same for our people that we work with, and serving and veteran and, you know, civilian. If people, maybe we don't tell people enough how special they are and how valued they are, because certainly the suicides that I've known, and, you know, over my time I've had quite a lot, I would suggest they didn't know. But then afterwards, everyone talks about so-and-so, don't they, and says how brilliant they were, and if only we'd known. And I do think there's something in that maybe we should tell people what we value in them. Maybe not that we love them, because clearly we don't love everyone.
No, but I think that's a really good point, is about investing just a bit more time into others, and not to be consumed by distractions. And actually, we're here to connect with each other, which brings us back to the start. Pam, I'm absolutely delighted that you could take the time to speak to me today. You're one of the most incredible people that I know, and your mental resilience is seriously big. It's unbelievable how you are able to do what you do and do what you've done for the benefit of a lot of my friends and colleagues, and to continue to do that now when you're back at work with what you've personally gone through is a testament to you. And that's the reason why the Royal Marines wanted you back, because you're an incredible person and you do incredible things. So thank you so much, and I wish you all the best fortune in the near and distant future.
Thank you, Mo. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks. You're doing great things.